Please welcome Dr. Arik Kershenbaum to the show. Thanks for joining us, Arik.
Hi there. Thank you for inviting me.
Um, you do fascinating work. Can you give us an overview of what your research involves, what that looks like, and also what is the end game? I mean, what do you hope to achieve through your work?
Well, I work with animals in the wild pretty much exclusively. I do a little bit of work with zoo animals, but mostly animals in the wild. So we're looking at how they interact, how they communicate, why they communicate, what they're using their communication for, and the uses of well, there are two real main goals of what we do. The first thing is to understand, right? We've got to understand what animals are, why they behave the way they do. This is a really important thing for scientific inquiry. We all think we know what animals are, but when you get out there in the wild and they have all these strange behaviors, we want to know why that is. So the big element of it is this behavior, understanding the behavior of wild animals like wolves and dolphins and tigers and so on. But the other big application is for conservation. So we can leverage a lot of our understanding of animal behavior and how we can manipulate animal behavior, how animals manipulate each other's behavior, how we can intervene in that process for conservation goals of various kinds.
So when we talk about language capacities in animals, we always, it seems, run into this idea of anthropocentrism. That people assume animals communicate purely for practical purposes. Like finding food, avoiding predators, etc. But your research and the research of others suggests that their communication is far more nuanced and sophisticated than just two grunts, I'm hungry, one grunt, I'm horny.
Well, some of it is, and some animals have more sophisticated communication needs and some have less. It wouldn't be right to say that all animals have complex communication. Some simply don't need it. But for those animals, particularly those animals that live in large, complex groups, they have complex interactions between individuals, lots of stuff going on, lots of dominance interactions, and who is my friend, who is my enemy, a lot of sort of social stuff going on. They need complex communication. It really benefits them to be able to convey how they feel, convey what their intentions are, understand what the intentions of other animals are. So you really need to look at what the social structure of animals is, of a particular species, and then from that you can think about, well, how much do they need to say to each other? Some animals do need to say more than just I'm hungry, I'm not hungry. And that's where it gets really interesting. That's where we see some really complicated communication evolving.
Well, this is interesting because this is kind of a crossover for us because we recently interviewed a guy named Brian McVeigh, he was a protege of Julian Jaynes, whose idea of the development of human consciousness, taking a kind of a major leap shortly after the Bronze Age, because for the just the reasons you mentioned, that the social structures became so complex that suddenly he theorized that the mind before that was bicameral, and suddenly the two spheres of the brain were communicating more fluidly, and it was because of not the outside circumstances presented to us by environment, but by our own cultural structure. In my intro, I was talking about my friend Thomas Konstam, the novelist. He's writing a novel called Blowhole that deals in part with John C. Lilly, who obviously you must be familiar with his work with the bottlenose dolphins. The dolphins, I mean, they have highly developed, the more folded cerebral cortex, which is responsible for elevated cognitive functions, problem solving, planning, understanding language, suggesting that there's actually advanced neuron connectivity in all this folding and processing capabilities far beyond what anybody really gives them credit for. This correlates with developed social structures and the ability to form bonds, to play, cooperate, etc. He even wanted him to have a seat on the United Nations. That's how strongly he believed that dolphins were actually more intelligent than us. Now, I know you've done a lot of studies. Wolves and dolphins are among the animals you've studied the most. Can you talk to me about what do you think of John C. Lilly's estimation of the linguistic capabilities of dolphins?
Well, I do agree that, as I said, social structure, social complexity is a really huge driver of intelligence and of communication and communicative complexity. And we are increasingly understanding that. We're increasingly thinking that various important steps in human evolution were driven by social complexity rather than environmental complexity. That does seem to be the way that things are going. And when you look at various animals in the wild, dolphins included, but other complex social animals, primates, and chimpanzees, and other primates, you do see a correlation between their social complexity and their cognitive abilities, which makes total sense. Right? It makes total sense. If you have to decode and decompose social interactions, you need to have an understanding of what others are thinking, for instance. So that is there's a very clear evolutionary link there. The problem comes when you ask the question, do they have language? If you're going to put someone on the United Nations, you need a translator a sort of real-time translator to tell them what the other speeches are saying and so on. Do they have language? And that seems to be the big stumbling block. There seems to be even those species that have these complex social groups, complex interactions, don't seem to need what we call language. And I think it would be a little bit, it would be inappropriate to place an animal in the United Nations if actually we're missing the point with where their cognition is going. If the cognition is not going down the avenue of language as we know it, then we're just trying to impose on them something that they don't really need.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that, I mean, it's not going to be totally helpful to geo-global politics at this point until we understand a little more. But I mean, you pointed out that language is in your research. That language is not necessarily advantageous in the context of natural selection.
Absolutely. I mean, the best example is think who hasn't wanted to fly like a bird, right? Flying is a fantastic ability. We'd all like to fly. We don't fly. Why don't we fly? We don't need to. Our ancestors never needed to fly, and so we didn't evolve wings. Not everything that is a great idea evolves in every species. Some have more need and some have less need. And in fact, having wings and being able to fly would be incredibly wasteful for our ancestors. So there wasn't an evolutionary force to drive this ability. And the same thing goes with language. Same thing goes with language. It's great. We use it for incredible ends, sometimes positive, sometimes less so. But just because we find this huge use for language doesn't mean that every other animal would benefit from it, just like we do. And in particular, something happened. Something happened during human evolution, 1 million years ago, maybe something like that. And our ancestors took this sort of leap, this step change of what they needed for their social communication that really gave a premium to this linguistic ability. Other animals aren't there. They don't need that.
One thing and I think some of this is hierarchical. I mean, I think you kind of touched on this before. It's like, if we know who our friend and enemy is, that's pretty basic. Everybody in nature seems to know that. But when the social structure becomes a little more complex and we have to have alliances within that hierarchy or culture, like, well, this is my friend's friend. And, I mean, once the farther that branches out, the context of our social interactions, this is what we talk about when we're talking about complex social structures.
Yes, and I think that that's really crucial for the evolution of language as well, because if you don't understand that another individual has their own mind and their own thoughts and knows things that you don't know and you know things that they don't know, then language doesn't make much sense. Right? Language is partly about conveying information that you have that someone else doesn't have. So I think it's not surprising that our ability to understand that others were individuals with their own minds probably preceded our evolution of language. Now, there are very few species, we believe, there are very few species that have that ability to understand that other individuals have minds of their own. Um,
Well, elephants and dolphins
I,
both have names, right? So
very
that would
few, but not none. Yes. So absolutely,
the fact
exactly
that they have
those
names would
species.
that's self-awareness.
I- it's a difficult question to answer. It's not quite simple enough just to say that is proof. It's a controversial subject. Quite how you prove that someone understands this idea that others are individuals in their own right. But we do believe that dolphins, elephants, chimpanzees, there's probably this handful of creatures that have that ability, but it is only a handful.
So, like, to have self-consciousness or self-awareness, but not have language, I mean, one would think that, empathy would be tied to that, but we can clearly see that animals that don't necessarily have languages are empathetic, and capable of great empathy. I mean, anybody with a dog or, for instance, I had a hen that literally died of a broken heart, and I did some research, and it's not I mean, she died of a broken heart because she was alone. Her flock mates had all been taken by predators. I live in the woods, and I mean, this time it was a weasel, but in the past it's been, mostly air predators, but there was nothing wrong with the hen. She just sat there, and it was interesting. My dog, my cat, they both sat up there in the backyard all day, just sort of curious, as if they kind of knew what's going on here, and she just sat there, and I eventually, put her carefully back in her roost, and the next day she was dead.
Yeah, but we have to be careful. People are often reluctant to talk about animals and emotions, whereas actually animals are more equipped with emotions, relatively speaking, than humans are. Humans, we are rational creatures. We are distinguished from other species by our rationality, not by our emotions. Animals have emotions. Emotions are the most basic form of motivating cognitive process. Fear, hunger, loneliness. For a social animal, if you imagine a hen in a flock or a wolf in a pack, to be isolated from your pack mates is a very stressful situation. And it's not surprising that they evolve cognitive mechanisms to react to that. So animals are very emotional, more emotional, I would say, than humans are relative to the sort of total cognitive process. So that in itself isn't surprising. The question is, where does that turn into an ability to grasp this concept that others have their own minds? And you can be empathetic, and you can be lonely, and you can want to be with your pack mates and still not quite understand that idea that you have your mind and another wolf in the pack has its mind, and that's a different mind. This seems to be the sort of the key leap that is necessary for the kinds of social interactions that were present in our ancestors and probably led to the evolution of language.
So for me, intuitively, it kind of feels like, I mean, the ultimate question about being human is, uh, isolation or community, right? We're born alone, we die alone, but we are not apex predators. We cannot make it on our own. We are so reliant on our dependence and our interdependence upon one another. I mean, just the very fact that we're talking about language here, there's nobody alive today that was ever short of coding and maybe Esperanto. There's nobody alive today that had anything to do with creating that language. So even as generations, I mean, we're dependent upon the whole evolution of the human consciousness in a sense. I mean, we're still the building blocks that were created generations and generations and hundreds of generations before, we're still dependent upon those now.
But there are, of course, so many animals that are totally dependent on living in a group as well. And they feel that no less than we do. Again, wolves and a wolf pack, chimpanzees in a chimpanzee troop. These are even animals that live in relatively small family groups. Gibbons in a group of close relatives. These are animals that rely on their group to survive, and it's not surprising that they've evolved all kinds of cognitive and behavioral adaptations to make that group living work well. Now, the cognitive and behavioral adaptation that we have particularly evolved is language. That's one evolutionary strategy. That's one technique that we use to make group living work more smoothly for us. And probably because we live in really very large and complex groups. In a pack of 10 wolves is one thing. In a village of 100 humans, that's quite a different level of social complexity. So really, while the need to be in a group and the need to manage that reliance on others is shared with other species, something about the way that humans, or our ancestors at least, did it was really quite exceptional.
Well, I think of pack animals like dogs, wolves, huskies. There's definitely a hierarchy within the pack. There's the alpha, then there's the betas and everybody. But when you talk about human society, you're now talking about a level of specialization that's, far beyond that. In order to serve the infrastructure of the larger community, we have tinkers and tailors and candlestick makers, etc. So, how does this breaking down of the social structure, do you think? I mean, I'm sorry, this is a little abstract. I can just see you're looking like a dead chicken there. Like, where's he going with this? Um, this form of specialization to human society seems to me to be sort of the key. I mean, how much it doesn't culture accelerates, human culture in particular. We've seen since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen such a exponential acceleration of culture. Have we seen that in whales? Have we seen that in wolves?
So one of the big differences between a lot of these species that you mentioned and human society is precisely that the social structure is actually quite simple. If you talk about hierarchies in wolves, that's a little bit of a misrepresentation. They don't really have that kind of strict dominance hierarchy that oftentimes people think that they do, and that's because wolf packs are by and large family groups. Extended family groups, oftentimes with unrelated individuals, but they're primarily family groups. And a lot of animals live in family groups. And when you live in a family group, relationships are relatively simple, relatively straightforward. There's always some sort of family interest at play. There are evolutionary reasons why you might want to help your brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews and so on. When you get to groups that are larger and less family based, chimpanzees, for example, then there's a lot of this sort of dominance interplay. There's a lot of struggling for position, and that's where you tend to get a little bit of this specialization that you've referred to. There may be one individual who um, can raise their prominence and their success in the group by carrying out a certain task better than another task. And so I think it's a reasonable hypothesis that something like that happened in our distant past. We started living in large groups, essentially unrelated individuals, and then there's a premium for um, uh, who's gonna stand out, be more successful by being a better hunter or by being a better builder of shelters. And so it's in those large unrelated groups that you start to get those more complex interactions taking place.
This is where we start talking about infrastructure for something larger than a family group.
Right, and that's not very common in the animal world. So chimpanzees are an example, but they're quite a rare example. Most groups of animals in the wild are are of related individuals.
Is
I
it
pause. I
easy?
mean, I hesitate because someone's going to come up with the example of wildebeest or something like that. But that's very different. It's a very different mating system. The key thing about chimpanzees is that you've got lots of males and lots of females all together. So it's a much more complex dynamic than if you have like one male stallion and a herd of female horses.
And, it seems like an easier one to observe and research than something as wide ranging as dolphins or whales, who range so widely. I mean, I don't know how their society is set up or their families are set up. I do know that recently it's been back in the news that the orca here in the Puget Sound is carrying around her dead baby, her stillborn baby. Um, but is it does that present more of a challenge to observe and study something that ranges all over the world underwater versus like finding a pocket where wolves range or
Oh,
chimpanzees?
I mean, I don't know. I've chosen to study animals that are difficult to study. I'm not sure why. I just that's just the way it's worked out. No, dolphins are extremely difficult, but wolves are extremely difficult too. I mean, wolves are extremely shy. There's really it's extremely difficult to see them in the wild everywhere except for in Yellowstone, where it's relatively easy. But still, these are animals who will travel through the environment and with great ease in a way that you can't. They've just come from Yellowstone and, you're going through knee-deep snow. It's like, I don't understand how the wolves are doing this, but they do. They do it much better than we do. Working with gibbons in the jungle. Again, it's a species that can just swing from tree to tree, up and down mountains, and finding them is incredibly difficult. So I tend to work with animals that are difficult to follow, difficult to study, but that's where the sound comes in. That's where sound is a wonderful, wonderful tool because sound goes around trees and over mountains and you can hear them far away. And really, that's in some ways, sometimes the only tool we have to study these animals is by the sounds that they make.
This is ironic because your mic sounded so bad when we were doing our pre-check earlier, and you're like the guy that works with sound. So what does this look like? You have an area uh, in an environment where the animal you're trying to study ranges or exists, and you guys have to stealthily go around and install equipment. What are we talking about for microphones? Are these like omnidirectional? Give us. I want to know about the gear. Tell us about your gear.
So one of the things that we've really sort of pioneered, that my group has pioneered, is using passive monitoring to really to get detailed information on where animals are. So we put a whole range, a whole network of recording devices in the environment, relatively small, relatively simple recording devices, but they have this very important feature, which is that they're all connected. They're all monitoring GPS satellite information. So they're all synchronized. They all have exactly the same clock in them. And that means that we can measure very accurately when a particular sound, a howl or a whistle or a song, arrives at each microphone. And because sound travels relatively slowly, if you have a wolf howling somewhere in the mountains and you have a network of recording devices, that howl will arrive at each recording device at a different time. The nearby ones it'll arrive at first and further ones later. And you can use that information. If all of those devices have exactly the same clock, you can use that information to find out where the animal was howling, pinpoint its position without putting a collar on it, without observing it. Wolves are often active at night. You can't see them, but we can know exactly where they are and where they're moving and what they're doing just from our network of recording devices deployed across the environment.
And so you've observed also, this brings up a point, which is that you're talking about wolves communicating at long distances and obviously whales communicating at long distances. But you have observed different linguistic uh, characters when they're up and close. They sound different. There's more yipping. There seems to be a different sort of communication. The high to low range sort of howling that both whales and wolves do tend to be kind of more of a beacon, and they get up close and maybe these conversations, dare I say conversations, are a little more intimate. You see, you're skeptical. You're more
No,
anthropocentric than I thought you'd
absolutely.
be.
I agree. I don't. I actually I do agree with you. I think that one of the interesting things about human voice, human communication, is that there's a lot of information in the sound of our voice. There's not just the words and the meaning of the words, but you can identify individuals. You can identify the voice of your friends and your family. You know what they sound like. Very, very dense information content in the human voice. But that information content is all lost at a distance. All lost at a distance. You try and listen to what someone is shouting at you from a long way away. You won't be able to know. Won't tell who they are. Probably find it difficult to understand what they're saying. As soon as you go to a long range, that information intense, information dense communication medium just doesn't work. And so what animals have done is they've adopted a different strategy for long range communication, a strategy that's reliable over long distances, but can only contain a small amount of information. So, as you say, wolves will howl to each other. There's probably quite a lot of information in those howls, but nothing like the amount of information that they can convey when they're up close, yipping, growling, whining. There's much denser, much more information dense communication medium over short range. And that's just a constraint of physics. You can't do anything about that, really.
There's body language to consider, which I'm always telling my wife who rolls her eyes and sighs a lot, and I'm like, "Honey, what's wrong?" I know this. She's like, "Nothing. I'm just breathing." I'm like, "No, that's a sigh." Like, I'm super aware of nonverbal communication. Um, you can't do that from far away.
Exactly, yes. And we are all familiar, all of us who have pets, of course, are very familiar with the nonverbal communication of our pets. And that's the main way that we communicate with domestic animals. Uh, but the moment there is a tree in between you and another animal, you can't see that. You don't have that information. Sound goes round trees, light doesn't. And that's just a fundamental constraint of the physics of the world that we live in. And that, of course, has dictated the way that evolution has shaped animal communication. Long range communication is sound.
In texts, like, we don't have tone when we text each other. How many times have we all had some sort of awkward communication with somebody and we're like trying to read into it, like, is this sort of passive aggressive here or what are they saying? And I think a lot of that is just the intonation of our voice. I mean, I think, you've said that you don't believe that animals actually have words. So, I mean, so they're really dealing with tones and what those tones communicate, I'm guessing here, what the sounds are meant to get across. But explain why you believe animals don't have words.
So there are some animals that have some signals, some sounds that they use that have essentially what we would call semantic meaning. So they do mean something. You might have a particular sound that means warning leopard, and another different sound that means warning eagle. So there are some sounds that have these sort of referential that refer to a particular um, object or idea, but they're very few indeed, and almost exclusively constrained to alarm calls. So if you need to say, look out, there's a tiger behind you, you want to be absolutely clear, you want to make it, it's urgent, you want to make it absolutely clear what's going on, then this idea of having a particular sound that represents this, that's a great idea. It's an evolutionary advantage. You could see how something like that could evolve. When it comes to more subtle concepts, then animals don't seem to have this. They don't seem to have a specific sound that means I would like a banana or something like that. Now, that's not to say that they can't convey that message, but it's conveyed, or it seems to be conveyed in a more fuzzy way. Um, there are different acoustic expressions that could give different impressions to the listener. Am I happy? Am I sad? Am I angry with you? Or perhaps I'm angry with someone else. Those sorts of ideas can be conveyed, but it's not a word by word thing. This idea of a sentence made up of words, each word having a particular meaning, is a very, very human thing. And we really don't find that anywhere else in the animal world.
As a father of three, I'm just thinking about my babies, that frustration of being a young parent when the infant is crying and you don't know why. Are they hungry? Are they tired? It's usually because they need to be burped and they got some gas. That's what I learned from that. But it's a struggle. So, like, to imagine trying to create some sort of complex social structure when everybody's just not able to specifically pinpoint what their motive is, what they're trying to get out of there is a always sort of a transactional nature to communication. This is what, in the dramatic scenario, this is what makes dialogue effective. You know what I mean? Like, this is what moves drama, is that the transactional nature of somebody wants something from each conversation, right? And so good dialogue is always about, I'm talking like a novelist now, but good dialogue usually involves sort of dancing around what that subject is, just to activate the reader's sort of awareness of like what's really going on here. There's tension. Why is it? And making that a dance. Sorry to go off. It's just what I do. You're a
Yeah,
scientist. I'm a
and
novelist.
but you've touched on a really important point, which is that from a biological perspective, the definition of communication, what communication actually is manipulation. Communication is all about manipulation. It's the only reason it evolves. That is precisely what it is for. It sounds cynical. It's really not. The idea is that we communicate because we want to influence the behaviors of others. Now, I say want to. We think in a consciously about what we want, or subconsciously, but all organisms, all animals, and even plants will send signals that change the behavior of other organisms to their advantage. And that's why communication evolves. That's why communication evolved in the first place. And that's still why it evolves. It's all about, how do I change the behavior of another organism to my advantage?
It's hard to argue with that. I think that people just have a bad connotation with the word manipulation. Perhaps if we said persuasion, like as a novelist, I mean, fiction is manipulative. Okay. We're taking reality and we're shaping it according to really basically the Aristotelian laws of dramatic structure. But there's a manipulation to that too. I mean, everything is not, I mean, if fiction were written like reality, dialogue wouldn't be charged with all this tension. Be like, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm just buying some oranges. They're $3.99 a pound over here. I got my club card. Hey, did you notice it?" You know what I mean? The conversations would just be like insufferable. So there is, I mean, I just think people have a knee-jerk reaction to the word manipulation because it
Well, it
makes it sound
has.
like there's like you're just trying to gain. I mean, you are trying to gain advantage, but like persuasion, maybe.
Well, manipulation has ethical overtones to it, and the trouble with persuasion is it has cognitive overtones to it. So, a bacterium or an amoeba is not trying to do anything, or is not trying to persuade. It's not thinking. It's merely, like all of evolution. It's just a mathematical necessity. Those amoeba that can influence other organisms will be more successful and will have more offspring, and so there will be more of those kinds of amoeba around. So that evolutionary drive to be more successful, or rather the fact that more successful organisms just tend to be more numerous, and through evolutionary time, that's what turns into all the diversity of life that we see. Uh, that puts a huge premium on being able to change the behavior of the organisms around you, whether that's predators that are coming to eat you, whether it's prey that you want to eat, or whether it's members of your own species that you want to mate with. Definitely being able to influence members of your species to mate with you is a clear evolutionary advantage.
I got it right once. Um, Viruses, bacterias, they are obviously not conscious, but they are making a concerted effort to attack your, attack your body. And this is just an evolutionary, this is just about perpetuation, right? This is just about survival. This is not a,
Right. It's just a numbers game. It really is just a numbers game. I mean, people often ask me, do plants communicate? Sure, plants communicate. What do you think flowers are? Flowers are a way of manipulating the behavior of insects so that they will come and pollinate the plants. And that is, according to this definition, that is communication. That's another form of visual communication
I've
and
been reading a
olfactory.
lot about how they think that, the Buddhists have been saying plants are conscious or cognitive, not cognitive, but conscious or feel pain forever. But I've been reading more and more about trees communicating. What do you? Where can we go with
There's
that?
no, I mean, there's really no, although it sounds ludicrous, there's really no problem the moment that you accept my definition of what communication is. And the reason there's no problem is because my definition of communication, evolutionary definition of communication, requires no consciousness. Consciousness is not a part of it. Um, we tend to think of that consciousness and communication are somehow linked because we think of our of this semantic representation. If I say dog, you get a picture of a dog in your head, and it's totally tied down. Our language is totally connected to that concrete semantic relationship, which requires consciousness, right? It requires me to have an image in my head. But that's really only one tiny, tiny part of the communication that goes on in the world. Even if you leave aside plants and if you don't want to accept that plants communicate, when you think about other animals, when you think about the way that animals communicate, they're not doing this thing of I say a word and you get that picture in your head. They are manipulating the behavior of each other. When a wolf howls and it wants to warn another pack away from its territory, that is communication. That is manipulation of behavior. It doesn't really matter whether the other wolf sees a mental image of perhaps a more powerful wolf that it doesn't want to fight with. It doesn't matter what the level of cognitive representation that has. The effect is I'm changing the behavior of another organism.
Now, this one kind of bummed me out because we all kind of, this is kind of a, they're making these, they're with AI and stuff, we're able to now make these translators for languages so that it's so much more accessible now. You can carry this thing around to Portugal and it'll help translate. But you've said that we'll never be able to make one of those for a squirrel, and that kind of bums me out. Please explain.
Well, what we can't do, if you believe that animals don't have words, is that we can't have a translator in the sense that we'd have a translator for Portuguese or something like that. Because if there's no words, then
The
there's no
symbolic
words to translate.
representation, we come back to that, yeah.
Yes. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have any form of translation. And in fact, people have been working for many years on devices that will distinguish, for instance, between a friendly dog bark and an angry dog bark. That is eminently possible. I mean, if other dogs can understand what the difference between a friendly bark and an unfriendly bark, for sure computers can do it. That I'm sure we can do. As long as we're prepared to let go of this idea of a word for word translation, then I think that having tech that will help us understand what animals are trying to communicate to us is eminently possible. The trouble is that we're hung up on this idea that your dog is trying to say, well, I'd like to go to this dog park today rather than the one that I went to yesterday because I don't like. That's not going to happen. That kind of detailed translation is not going to happen because the communication itself isn't that detailed.
What if you drill down? So they give you some sort of general impression. Okay, I'm happy, I'm sad. And then you drill down from there and you find, using their sort of basic nomenclature, food. You figure out what their bark is for food. And it's like, are you happy? I'm thinking of the babies again. Are you unhappy because you're hungry? Are you unhappy because you're restless? I mean, is there a way? I mean, yes, no, there's no symbolic representation that's exact with the exactitude of words. But if we can understand these sort of block constructs of what they're trying to communicate, down to the basic fear, happiness, anxiety. Isn't there a model from there that you can kind of maybe whittle that down and get closer to the
Sure.
meaning?
Absolutely. I mean, you could certainly drill down to some level, and it depends on the species. Some will have a deeper level. Some will have a richer communication with more information in it, and some will have a simpler communication with less information in it. Your example of a squirrel, for instance, I tend to think that squirrels probably have fairly superficial communication, if only because they don't live in complex societies. Uh, Dogs and wolves live in more complex societies. I imagine it will be possible to drill down quite a way down, more than just happy, sad, hungry, thirsty. I think there are social there are social signals that were probably present in dogs and wolves that we would be amenable to some form of translation. But you're going to hit the bottom at some point. At some point, the animal's natural society, the behavior that they've evolved to have, the behavior that's advantageous to them, has a limited amount of information content in it. And that's going to be the floor that we would reach with any particular species. But it might be quite deep. There might be quite a lot of information there.
So, I mean, dogs apparently get a lot of information just from sniffing each other's butts. That's pretty kind of, I mean, not to be gross, but that's kind of fascinating. I mean, they say there's, I don't know what they ate, where they've been, where I don't know what they're getting down there, but it definitely seems like, I mean, it's the dog analog to a handshake, basically, I think. Yeah.
So smell is an interesting one because smell, although it's probably the oldest form of communication, probably evolved before any other form of communication, many, many hundreds of millions of years ago. Um, but it's also one of the least effective means of communication. I mean, it's really smell is a good channel for very, very simple signals. And it's true that you can infer quite a lot from the various smells that you come across. Infer things like, as you say, what someone's been eating, or are they stressed or happy. Those kinds of things you can probably determine. But don't forget, these are old signals. When you go to your fire hydrant, when your dog goes to the fire hydrant and smells whatever's there, the other dog could have been there an hour ago or yesterday. So by virtue of the fact that smell is a very slow way of communicating, it's never evolved to contain complex information because that information is almost immediately out of date. Whereas
Also, it seems
sound,
to be tied to fight or flight, like the smell of a predator, the smell of a because they say that the olfactory actually has a stronger memory than the other sights, than the other senses. Like I'll smell rock rose. Okay, rock rose. Well, when I was a kid, we had squirrel monkeys back in the '70s when it was legal to have exotic pets. My family had a couple of squirrel monkeys, and I remember the smell of that cage so well that every time I smell like rockers, and I was like 4 years old before the last of them died, so I hardly had language myself, or just barely. And every time I smell rock rose, I'm like, monkey shit. It smells just like monkey shit. And everyone looks at me like I'm crazy, but I'm telling you, it's like there's a specificity to smells, and I think that probably has some sort of evolutionary link to predation or, I mean, imminent danger or, pheromones for mating or you know what I mean? It seems like it's, almost precognitive, and that's maybe why the memory of it is so they say, so strong.
yeah, I'm sure, but that's also an excellent example of how unreliable a channel it is, right? Because there aren't any monkeys there, but you think there are. So this is one of the reasons why smell just has never evolved to be a truly rich and deep communicative channel. It's just too unspecific, too slow. Smells get mixed up very easily. One dog comes and pees on the same fire hydrant, and then what do you make of that? That then becomes very confusing. Um, yeah, sound and sight seem to be the two ways that animals really communicate complex ideas.
Now, I mean, language aside, I mean, you pretty much have humans on a level above any other animal you've studied, but do you think that certain animals possess forms of consciousness or awareness that are comparable to humans? And I mean, I guess how would we best detect or measure that consciousness? That's kind of your work, right? But I mean, do you believe that an animal can be as intelligent as a human being and not have language, like the dolphin with the folded cortex and all that?
Yeah, I think you gotta get down to the bottom of definitions here. Um, can an animal be conscious like a human? I think yes. I don't think it takes much difficulty to anyone who's had a dog or a cat and interacted with them and had that sort of you get that sense that there is something there. There's something in their mind, and there is. All right, these are conscious organisms. These are cognitive organisms. They are thinking. They are understanding. There's a lot going on there, and I don't think that there can be any doubt about that. The two things that the first thing that there could be a doubt of is whether they have that leap, that idea that I've got a mind, you've got a mind, our minds are different. That's something that we're not so confident about and is really difficult to test. But the idea that these are cognitive, conscious organisms, absolutely, 100%. There's no doubt about that. And then you ask about intelligence, and you just got to define what I don't really know what you mean by intelligence.
I guess the
There's
complexity of thoughts mixed with empathy, mixed with the capability to think abstractly, to reflect outside of one's own consciousness. Again, back to empathy, the ability to read the room in a more complex and nuanced manner.
Yeah. So I think that those capabilities that you describe are very closely tied to this idea of theory of mind or sense of self and other, this idea that I know I'm me and you're you and we're different. And I think when you don't have that, then a lot of these criteria that you've just placed on the table aren't really possible. So if you're an animal that doesn't have a sense that I have my mind, you have yours, and we're different, then I think you'd fail a lot of the tests that you've placed on the table. I would contest whether those are really tests of intelligence. I mean, those are specific cognitive abilities that certain animals have and other animals don't.
It's
Is that intelligence?
relativistic, right? I mean, we developed those and we use those as a measure because those are what we've developed.
Exactly, and we like to compare animals to what we can do. Um, it's reminded of a quote by an author who was writing about dolphin intelligence and tried to get down to the bottom of what is this intelligence. It's in Justin Gregg's book about dolphins, and came to the conclusion that, well, intelligence is really just the behavior you would expect of an adult human. That's a totally circular definition of intelligence, but it seems to be the only one um, that everyone is happy with. If you think about the way that a dolphin or a bat can analyze echo signals and build a map of the world around them from those echoes, that is an incredibly sophisticated, intelligent ability. I cannot do that. That is way beyond my ability to build a three-dimensional map of the world based on the echoes of the sounds that I hear. But that's not how we choose to call. That's not what we choose to call intelligent. So I think intelligence is a really, really problematic term in that sense.
Yeah. Well, this is I think kind of a perfect transition to talk about xenolinguistics because we're talking about using our own measure for intelligence to look for life outside the solar system, to look for complex life. And this is going back to John C. Lilly, that was kind of his selling point was to the scientific community was that, look, you guys are looking to communicate with alien life forms and try to understand what that communication may look like. Well, we have one right here on Earth. So why don't we start by trying to, talk to me about your work because as well as being as well as Why Do Animals Talk, you're also the author of Zoologist's Guide to the Galaxy, which deals largely with xenolinguistics. So talk to me about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and how that involves how you're involved in that.
So there's two things that interest me really about the search for extraterrestrial life. One is thinking about what life might be like on other planets and seeing how we can apply what we know about evolution on Earth to what life might be like on other planets. But the reality is, if we go out and look and find life on other planets, the vast majority of what we find will probably be very simple life. I don't doubt that there are planets out there with complex life on them, but the majority of planets with any life will have just simple life,
Microbial,
microbes, for instance. Yeah,
beneath the ice even.
yeah. Now, I'd love to go and explore a planet and find alien birds and alien worms, who sort of avatar-like ecosystem. That would be fantastic. But to discover that, we'd have to go there. And so the only other option is if we find out about alien life because they sent us a signal. Now, that's a very, very, very different kind of life. There's a joke in the SETI community. Heard this from a friend of mine who's at the SETI Institute, that there are two kinds of organisms in the universe: folks and critters. Folks is anyone who can build a radio telescope, and critters is everything else. Now, this is coming from a radio astronomer, so a slightly biased perspective. But the point here is that whatever life there is in the universe, if a planet has intelligent dolphins on it, for the sake of argument, if they can't build technology, if they can't build a radio telescope to send signals, we'll never know about them. And so the only intelligent species in the universe that we will ever get to know about are those that have technology. And that means they're actually likely to be quite similar to us. Right? Dolphins have not developed technology. Dolphins do not need technology. Doesn't matter how intelligent they are. They're not a technological species. And so if they were on another planet, we would never know. But if there were human-like creatures on another planet that built machines and technology, spaceships and so on, then we might know about them. So I think we can expect those to be more similar to us than we think.
So we're winding down here. I'm going to ask one for the sci-fi nerds, though, because it's kind of, we've sort of, this kind of dovetails into, what you were just talking about, is that, based on what you've learned from studying animal intelligence, do you think there are any species on Earth whose intelligence might evolve in ways that could rival human abilities in the distant future? Maybe not in a Planet of the Apes way. Like we've discussed, that may look differently, but do you sense maybe a better way to frame that is, do you sense in what we know about the animals you're studying, that anybody who's evolving culturally at a speed close to us?
That's a common fallacy, to think that there are animals out there who want to be like humans, who are evolving towards being human-like, the Planet of the Apes sort of fallacy. The reality is, though, that life existed on Earth for 4 billion years before humans evolved. And life was doing just fine for at least 300 million of those 4 billion years. In the last 250 million years, life on Earth has been really complex, really, really complex. And human-like organisms could have evolved at any stage in the last 250 million years, but didn't. And the niche that humans occupy is actually quite a specific niche. The vast majority of organisms and species that have ever existed simply didn't need language. It was not helpful to them. Language, technology, none of these things were necessary. Something happened 2, 3, 4 million years ago, and our ancestors started off on a path that led us to where we are now. But it's a very specific, very particular path that other animals just don't need to follow and just don't get an advantage from following. So I think that rather than thinking that all of creation is somehow struggling to get to be like us, I think it's a better way of looking at it is that we're the weird ones.
That
We're
is
the outliers.
anthropocentrism, what you're
We've just
talking
sort of
about.
we've gone off down some peculiar route and exploited this very, very specific niche, and all the other organisms are like, nah, that's not for us.
But just to be devil's advocate here, since now as a species we are exercising such we're changing the environment for everybody. We're changing the seas, we're changing the environment, we're taking down the rainforest, almost in a sense forcing other species to maybe adapt quicker like we did in an accelerated manner because of outside forces. I mean, would this be a window into looking for maybe the development of more complex cultural development in species, even if it doesn't look human, but as a result of having to react to changes that humans have made within this environment?
Unfortunately, from what we understand about the evolutionary history of the Earth, when something comes along that really rapidly changes the environment as we are doing, then the result is almost inevitably a drastic reduction in complexity, reduction in ecosystem complexity, reduction in diversity. And that is not a good environment for producing more complex organisms. So, when you've had mass extinctions in the past, they've tend to collapse the range of available niches. And so, even if complexity rebounds, which it does eventually, given enough millions of years, it does. But unfortunately, I think we're going to see a drastic reduction in the ability of animals and other organisms to cope with the world around them, rather than increased stability.
He is the fascinating Arik Kershenbaum, author of The Zoologist's Guide to the Galaxy, as well as Why Do Animals Talk? Arik, thanks for joining me, putting up with my goofy questions today. I'm just kind of a dumb, curious guy trying to get smarter, learn, just follow my natural curiosity. So I appreciate your patience and thanks for joining us
No,
today.
that was great. A great bunch of questions.